So we'll start with assembling the head assembly, and we're going to be wrapping plumber's tape or Teflon tape around each of the threadings. Usually you'll wrap this in the clockwise motion. If you do counterclockwise, when you go to thread the piece onto it, it'll actually kind of undo the tape a little bit. So I've just wrapped a few wraps of plumber's tape on a quick connect, which is optional. And then I'm attaching that onto a simple crank timer. Whatever timer you've got is fine. After the timer is when you want to install the backflow preventer. After you've wrapped plumber's tape around the threading, and after the backflow preventer, you install the filter. So it's always in this order: timer, backflow preventer, filter. More plumber's tape, and then your pressure regulator or pressure reducer, more Teflon tape, and then the hose start or swivel adapter. Basically, it is what connects from all of these components to the supply line or the solid tubing that you use. And you really just sort of jam it into the adapter, and it'll hold when you're ready to install. So this is at the spigot, and I'm attaching the quick connect onto a hose Y, so you can see just how the quick connect works. If you choose to use it, it just makes it very easy to take that entire thing on and off, which you'll do in the winter so it doesn't freeze. And then once you've attached a hose Y, you'll always have the water spigot turned on. And then when you're running drip irrigation, you'll leave using those small black valves on the hose Y. You'll use that to leave the drip on, and then you'll use that to turn your hose on and off when you need that. So now in the garden where you want to install drip irrigation in your bed, I have the head assembly over at the spigot. I've run supply line out to the bed, and it's continuing on to other beds. So now I want to tee off of that main line. And you can use different types of tees. I'm using one that has locks on it, nuts that you tighten. There's all sorts of different kinds, and they'll all work just fine. So use those, and you make cuts that are nice and vertical, so straight up and down. I like to use garden pruners. Heavy-duty scissors would work fine. And I'm just cutting out where that T is then going to replace the solid tubing. So then it will be sort of a solid line again. So I made a couple cuts. Probably don't have much use for that little bit of plastic anymore. And then in this case, I'm putting the tubing over a little bit of a nub, and then it has a sort of a nut that locks to make it tight. Different fittings, you might, some of them actually go inside the tubing. They all work slightly different, but they all work about the same. So you get both ends in. And if the tubing is kind of hard to work with for some reason, maybe it's a cold day, you can bring a hot, like a thermos or something, and dip the tubing in that, and it'll actually warm and soften the tubing and be a lot easier to work with. So now I'm going to take the tubing out and go into the garden bed. And you can use measuring tape for this if you want to. You don't have to. What I like to do actually when I'm working with drip is kind of take that whole roll of supply tubing, the 1/2 inch supply tubing, and just connect one end, which I'm doing there on the right, to the T. And then I'm going to just cut it in place right where I know the edge of the bed is, versus measuring ahead of time, because then maybe I'm off, or maybe things get a little messy out in the garden. So I'm walking over, laying out my solid supply line, and then as soon as I get to the edge of the bed, I've made a cut, and again, using a nice vertical cut. And I've added a few extra inches because I'm putting on an end cap, and this particular kind is the figure 8, where you take 4, 5, 6 inches and you fold it back over itself, and then it goes into that little piece of plastic, and believe it or not, that's enough to keep water from coming out. So I've now capped that line. I have my bed basically connected to the main line. And now we're going to install the drip line. So I'm measuring the bed. It's about 4 feet, and I'm going to space my individual 1/4 inch drip lines about a foot apart. I'm just kind of using some sticks to help mark where I want to punch my holes and connect them. So I have about a foot in between each of my drip lines. So now I know where to punch the holes into the drip. And when you're using a punch, this is usually kind of the cheapest kind you'll see very often. It works fine. It can take a little bit more effort. And you're punching the hole so that the line, when it connects, is parallel to the soil. You don't want it coming from like the top of the supply line. You really want it from the side, essentially. This is a better type of punch tool. I think it's worth it if you're doing a lot of drip irrigation. It's maybe $15. It just tends to make much cleaner punches. So you're just punching small holes. And then I'm now working with the drip line that has the emitters in it, 1/4 inch drip line. And to connect them, I'm using what's called a transfer barb, and it's hollow. So one end goes into the drip line, which I like to do first. So, and there's a tool for that too, because that can be hard on your hands. And then the other end goes into the supply line, and usually you hear a nice satisfying little pop or click when it gets in place. And that should now be watertight, and it should be conveying water from the supply line into that drip line. And so I have that connected. And so at the other end, I'm going to use a pin, some goof plugs. I'm going to need my shears. And I'm going to basically, I've connected my whole length of drip line. I'm just going to walk it down. Again, I prefer this approach instead of cutting it ahead of time. So I walk it down to know exactly where the last emitter comes out in the garden bed. And that's where I'm going to make my cut. So at the end of the garden bed, I'm going to pin it down just to keep it in place. I found the last emitter. I want to keep that. The one with the arrow on it, that's kind of outside the bed, so I don't really need that. So I'm making a cut just past the last emitter that's in the garden bed that I want to keep. Make sure I don't get too much dirt in there. And then I'm using a goof plug. You use the small end of the goof plug and it plugs the line. The larger end is if you need to plug a hole like you punched in the wrong place in the supply line. So now that's watertight, and I'm using the pin. Please use metal pins. They work so much better than plastic pins to hold the lines down. And then rinse and repeat. So now I've sped it up a bit, but same process. Punch the 1/4 inch line to the supply line, go to the end, cut it, pin it, go to your next one, punch in, add a transfer barb, lay down. You want your emitters to be staggered where how close they are to the supply line. So on the right, when they're all lined up, you actually get gaps. And if that's not clear from that picture, I'll go over that again in a little bit. And that's about it. It really doesn't take that much time. It's really the design work and buying all the pieces, and you can see it starting to drip irrigation.